From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Steve Levingston, nonfiction editor of the Washington Post Book World, which is a charter sponsor of the National Book Festival. Before we begin, I've been asked to remind you that these events are being recorded by the Library of Congress, which may broadcast them at some future date. After our author's presentation, there will be time for questions from the audience. But if you don't want to become part of the library's permanent collection, it may be best to let someone else ask the questions. When Pope Benedict surprised the world with his announcement that he was stepping down, there was one person many people sought out to help them understand, and that was George Weigel, a man of vast knowledge of the Catholic Church. Pope Benedict's decision also couldn't have come at a better time for Weigel, who had just published an insightful book on the challenges and opportunities facing Catholics today. His book, Evangelical Catholicism, points the way, in Weigel's view, toward the Catholic future. In previous books, Weigel has portrayed the life and influence of Pope Benedict and his predecessor, Pope John Paul II. In his latest, he enlightens readers to the new phase in Catholic history that these pontiffs have ushered in. It's an era that needs, in his view, deep Catholic reform and a sense of the Church as mission. George Weigel is the Distinguished Senior Fellow and Chair of Catholic Studies at the Ethics and Policy Center here in D.C. and was the founding president of the James Madison Foundation. His insights, while directed at Catholics, have a broader sweep. He laments what he sees as the widespread spiritual crisis as the human race enters the new millennium. Judeo-Christian traditions have fallen prey to what he describes as debonair nihilism. The anchors of our moral norms, he believes, have been uprooted, and truth and goodness and beauty have been lost. He speaks passionately of the need to recover beauty as a way to understand the divine. As he writes, in a disenchanted world, the enchantment of the beautiful is a rumor of angels, a hint of the transcendent, a pathway to God. These are big issues, matters of fundamental concern, and to help us address them, please join me in welcoming George Weigel.
Thank you, Steve. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I noticed on my way over to the tent that the Redskins had lost their third game in a row this afternoon, which means that some other form of nihilism than debonair nihilism will descend on the nation's capital like a dense fog later this evening. So I hope we can lift the spirits before that fog descends. I also want to take a point of personal privilege to ask all of you to commend the gentleman sitting in the first row here, the Librarian of Congress, Dr. James Billington, who has been for so many years a custodian of American culture, a friend of learning throughout the World Digital Library, of which he is a founding father, is going to be an extraordinary resource for humanity in centuries to come. And there really has been nobody, I think, that the American people could have better entrusted with this great national treasure called the Library of Congress than James Billington. So thank you, Dr. Billington, for all this years of service. It's interesting to think that when Pope Benedict XVI was elected 8.5 years ago in 2005, that we already knew something about his successor. or we could reasonably expect to know this. Whoever that man would be whenever it happened, whatever his previous life experience had been, the Pope following Benedict XVI would not have attended the Second Vatican Council. He would not have been part of that historic moment of the Catholic confrontation with modernity, which took place 50 years ago. As it happened, Pope Benedict surprised all of us by laying down the office of Peter at the end of February, and indeed his successor, Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, did not attend the Second Vatican Council. He was a young priest in Argentina at the time. The reason I mention that is that it should have been clear in 2005 with the election of this great theological mind to the office of Peter, Joseph Ratzinger, that we were at the end of a period in the history of the Catholic Church. Something new was opening up. And the book that I am here to discuss very briefly, because I'm sure you all are much more interested in questions and conversation at this late stage of the day than listening to a lecture. The book that I have just published a few months ago, Evangelical Catholicism, Deep Reform in the 21st Century Church, is in the first place an attempt to explain just what this transition is and where it began, when it began, and with whom it began. There is a tendency in the church, in the media, in other Christian communities throughout the educated world to imagine that what we know as the Catholic Church that's emerging in the early 21st century began on October 11th, 1962, with the opening of the Second Vatican Council. In the first part of my book, I tried to challenge that conventional wisdom by broadening the historical lens and seeing the Second Vatican Council, which, as you know, met from 1962 to 1965, as a critical moment in a process of evolutionary change in the Church, which really began in 1878. In 1878, Pope Pius IX, who had been Pope for 32 years, died. Died as what he described himself as being the prisoner of the Vatican. 7 years before the unification of Italy had been completed, the Pope lost what was left of the Papal States and retired behind the Leonine Wall, from which he never emerged again. The cardinals at the conclave of 1878 evidently thought they needed a place warmer, so they elected a 68-year-old cardinal, Italian, Gioacchino Vincenzo Pecci, whom they imagined would, if you would, keep the throne warm for a few years till a younger man would come along. Pecci, elected, took the name Leo XIII, and having succeeded the longest-running pope in history, proceeded to have the second longest pontificate in history, lasting until 1903. A few years before his death, he was meeting with an American bishop who was a little teary-eyed at the end of their conversation and said to the 90-year-old Pope, "Holy Father, I suppose this is the last time we'll see each other on this earth." And the 90-year-old Pope reached over and patted him on the arm and said, "My dear man, you didn't tell me you were feeling poorly." In any event, the 68-year-old placeholder turned out to be a great reformer who opened the period of Catholic history that marked the end of the Counter-Reformation Church that was born in the 16th century in the religious turmoil of the fracturing of Western Christendom, and opened the door to what the last three popes have called the Church of the New Evangelization, the Church of Evangelical Catholicism. Leo XIII did this by initiating a new Catholic encounter with modern intellectual life, by encouraging Catholic biblical studies, by leading a reform of the Church's understanding of its own history. This was the Pope who opened the Vatican archives to qualified scholars of all or no denomination. This was the Pope, Leo XIII, who in 1891 launched what we call modern Catholic social doctrine with his encyclical on the social question caused by the Industrial Revolution. Leo XIII set in motion dynamics that, not without difficulty, throughout the 20th century led to the Second Vatican Council. Every one of the great intellectual and pastoral reform movements of mid-20th century Catholicism can be traced to the pontificate of Leo XIII. That dynamic that he set in motion reached a kind of critical mass 50 years ago, in the 4 dramatic years of Vatican II. Vatican II left the Church and the world 16 documents, but unlike the previous 20 ecumenical councils, it defined no doctrine, it condemned no heresy, it wrote no new canons into the law of the Church, and it didn't anathematize anybody. None of the traditional keys for understanding what a council had intended were present. If you want to know what the Council of Nicaea meant, you read the creed of the Council of Nicaea, which many Christians do every Sunday. If you want to know what the Council of Chalcedon meant in the 5th century, you read its dogmatic definition of the relationship of the divine of the human in Christ. If you want to know what the First Vatican Council meant, you read its dogmatic definition of the infallibility of the Bishop of Rome under certain circumscribed circumstances. Vatican II had none of that. No creed, no dogma, no condemnations, no anathemas, no canons. So, as most of you here know, what resulted was a 25-year contest in the Catholic Church to figure out what Vatican II was really all about. The answer to that, I believe, came in the pontificate of John Paul II, who systematically offered an authoritative interpretation of each of the key themes of Vatican II, and perhaps most importantly, in his apostolic letter closing the Great Jubilee of 2000, issued on the Solemnity of the Epiphany, January 6, 2001, a document called Novo Millennio in Eunte, entering the new millennium, wrote that the Church had to leave the shallow waters of institutional maintenance and, like the disciples listening to Jesus on the Sea of Galilee in the 5th chapter of Luke's Gospel, had to put out into the deep for a catch. A catch of what? A catch of human beings, a catch of men and women waiting to hear the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. That document, I believe, marks a hinge point in the history of the Church. It's the point at which the door, if you will, of the Counter-Reformation closes and the door of the new evangelization opens. New evangelization then became a consistent theme in the pontificate of Benedict XVI, which described in the Pope's signature phrase, friendship with Jesus Christ as the center of the Christian life. And this Evangelical Catholicism is manifestly the mode of being Catholic that the new Pope, the Pope from the New World, Pope Francis, wishes to commend to the entire world church. It's the same Catholic Church. It's the same Lord, the same faith, the same baptism. But as the church of the New Testament, the church we read about in the Acts of the Apostles, eventually gave way to what we call the Church of the Fathers, the Church of Augustine and Ambrose and John Chrysostom and Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, Maximus the Confessor. And that church, after 500 years, gave birth to what we know as medieval Christendom, the Church of Anselm and Aquinas, Dominic and Francis, Catherine of Siena, other great figures. That church, in turn, had a good 500-year run, but it eventually gave way to the Church of the Counter-Reformation in the midst of the turmoil of the 16th century. And that Counter-Reformation Catholicism, the Catholicism in which everyone in this tent who's over 50 years old grew up and remembers, has in its turn given way to a fresh and dynamic mode of being Catholic that in the second part of the book I try to describe. It's a Catholicism that asks us not simply to know about Jesus Christ, but to know him personally and to enter into a friendship with him that creates radically converted disciples for whom all of life is shaped by Christian conviction. It's a church with an intensified focus on word and sacrament. The Bible, baptism, and the Holy Eucharist in particular are regular occasions, must become regular occasions on which the Catholics of the third millennium are nourished to be the missionary disciples they're called to be. It's a church that's calling Catholics to a much more sophisticated understanding of their faith. The old, simple catechism questions and answers, which so many of us remember, worked for their time. But that time is not this time. This time demands a deeper learning about the truths of Christian faith and their implications on how we ought to live. And above all, this Catholicism to which the trajectory from Leo XIII through Benedict XVI and now on to Pope Francis is leading the Catholic Church emphasizes mission effectiveness. This is a mission-driven Catholicism which understands that everywhere is mission territory. Catholics enter mission territory every day, beginning with their own families, extending to their professional and business lives, their social lives, their cultural lives, their political lives. It's interesting to note that in the first 6 months of his pontificate, the new Pope has, on at least a half dozen occasions, complained, criticized what he calls a self-referential church. I take it from a conversation I had with him in Buenos Aires 15 months ago that what he means by that kind of self-referentiality is a church that has become evangelically slack, that has lost its muscle tone, if you will. A church that has become accustomed to being a kept institution, kept by legal establishment as it was for so long in Latin America and parts of Europe, later kept by cultural habit. This Pope knows, as his two predecessors knew, as the Second Vatican Council intuited, that a Catholicism that has not rediscovered the Great Commission of Matthew 28, go and baptize all nations in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Church that does not put mission at the center of its life is a church that will wither and die. Cultural circumstances of the Western world are such that the culture no longer transmits the faith. Indeed, the culture is often very hostile to biblical religion. In that kind of a circumstance, Christianity, Catholicism must be proposed, and it must be witnessed to. In his recent interview, which has caused such an interesting stir, if we get beyond the 17 words that were excised out of 12,000 words to look at the whole document, we find a marvelous and indeed quite striking image. Pope says, "I think of the church as a kind of field hospital after a battle," which raises the question, what's the battlefield? What's been the battle? Where are these wounded coming from? And I think in his view, they're coming from the pathologies of late modernity and post-modernity, false promises of what makes for human happiness, self-absorption that finds it impossible to make lifelong commitments, a certain coldness in our measuring of other human beings, whom we measure by the criterion of utility rather than the criterion of dignity. All of this suggests the need for that field hospital to be a place that actively brings in, invites the walking wounded in to meet the divine mercy, to meet what Catholics believe is the truth of the human condition, manifest in Christ the Lord, and to enter into a community of conviction, of compassion, of service to the world, a community that in this past century has experienced the greatest period of martyrdom in its 2,000-year history, a community that is still under grave pressure in both developing and developed countries today. In the third part of the book, I then try to describe visiting just about every aspect of Catholic life, the episcopacy, the priesthood, consecrated religious life, the lay vocation, Catholic higher education, the liturgy, Catholics in public life, and the Vatican and the papacy. I try to outline a program of necessary change measured by the two criteria of authentic Catholic reform. The criterion of truth: does this proposed alteration cohere with what John Paul II called the symphony of truth that we find laid out in the Catechism of the Catholic Church? And the criterion of mission: does this proposed alteration, change, development add to the mission effectiveness of the Church? That's the proposal in the book, a new way of looking at modern Catholic history, a description of the characteristics of the Church that is being born in the 21st century, and a set of proposals for changing what must be changed in order that the Church might be the instrument of the divine mercy and the instrument of evangelization that it is being called to be. That's what I wanted to just lay out in front of you this afternoon. Went a little longer than I expected, but that'll give us some time for discussion, so thank you for your patience, which was what was a longer ramble than I expected to give, and I would be happy to entertain questions. I guess people go to the microphones. Yes, sir. Thank you.
My understanding of the evangelization is part of it is what you referred to as the missionary part, that Catholics are called to share the faith, recruit other people, however you want to look at it. To me, that doesn't resonate at all as a Catholic. That's not our history or what we do, kind of stick to ourselves. And I have a hard time seeing how that mission that goal is becomes successful with Americans.
Well, one thing you could do if circumstances ever take you to Greenville, South Carolina, not what you would imagine as in the very heart and gizzard of Catholic America, Bible Belt, middle-sized American city, where you happen to find what I think is probably the best Catholic parish in the United States. Its pastor is one of the men to whom I dedicate this book. And every year at the Easter Vigil, they bring anywhere from 30 to 50, sometimes even 60, new adult converts into the parish, because the people of the parish have gotten the idea that they are living out the promises of their baptism, not simply by their own sporadic practice, but by inviting others to share their faith. It really begins as simply as that. When I go around the country, as you can imagine, talking about this, people ask me, what's the first thing I can do? I said, invite somebody to church with you next Sunday. It's not really a whole lot harder than that. We now have marvelous instruments of explaining the beauty and richness of Catholicism, and instruments like this magnificent film series made by my friend Father Robert Barron of Chicago, the Catholicism series. Stunningly good stuff. Deep, beautiful, compelling. It really isn't that hard. But you're absolutely right that when you and I grew up, missionaries were brave men and women who went to very strange parts of the world where they occasionally died extremely unpleasant deaths. And if you were a 10-year-old boy, you liked to read about the gory deaths as part of the package here. Every Catholic must think of themselves as a missionary today. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, two questions. One, the role of women in the church, women religious in the United States. As you know, there have been some feisty sisters and their allies. And the second question has to do with the evangelical thrust and how that will be responded to and heard in the world of Islam, which has certainly felt that it has been under the eye of those who wish to deviate people from the world of the prophet and his followers.
I have a whole chapter on the reform of religious life in the book. That's the long answer. The short answer is that the communities of religious life, consecrated life, either women or men, that are growing in the United States and indeed around the world, are the communities that have embraced the fullness of the symphony of Catholic truth, and the communities that are dying, literally, there will be none shortly, alas, are those who have gone off into various, particularly doctrinal experiments that have not simply proved, they've simply not proven fruitful. So I think the landscape of religious life, both for men and women in the United States, consecrated life, nuns and priests and brothers, is going to look very different 20 or 30 years from now than it looks today. I think on the question of Islam, the much criticized and I believe deeply insightful lecture of Benedict XVI at Regensburg, shortly after his election, when he said, he reflected upon the difficulties that the Catholic Church had had coming to grips with political modernity, with democracy, with the idea of religious freedom as a fundamental human right. And he said, perhaps we can be of some help to Muslims who are trying to think through from within their own religious convictions an Islamic theory of religious tolerance. We'll save religious freedom for maybe 500 years from now. We'll settle for religious tolerance right now. And an Islamic theory of the legitimate distinction, if not separation in the American sense, between religious and political authority. The Pope was making a very important point. 1 billion Muslims are not going to become Rawlsian liberals. It just is not going to happen. And yet, if Islam and the rest of the world are going to live in a condition other than that described by Sam Huntington 12 years ago when he talked about the bloody borderlands, then those are the two questions. Can you come up with, from within your own religious and intellectual resources, a theory of religious tolerance? And can you come up with a, which would include, by the way, the right to convert in either direction, we would say, and a theory, an Islamic theory of the distinction between spiritual and political authority and the boundaries that ought to circumscribe the former in dealing with the latter. It's a complicated business, and it's not getting any easier, obviously. Yes?
Hi, thank you for talking. I had a question regarding, in terms of a purely secular policy, so is there any indication that the new Pope is going to change the secular policy? For instance, there was some talk about contraception and other past transgressions with other people that the Pope said, don't necessarily focus on that. Does that mean that there might necessarily be an introduction to contraception? I mean, the idea is these policies probably don't affect the Western world as much, but it does affect the Southern, South America. It affects a lot of other Catholic countries. The other part of the question I had is, as Europe and the U.S. become more secularized and there's more atheists and agnostics in the world, is there any outreach or any talk with these groups, any collaboration between the two groups? Thank you.
The Catholic Church's teaching on the moral life as lived in marriage is a settled business, and that's not going to change. I think what the Church has to do is do a much better job of explaining the yes that we say to a certain understanding of marital chastity and the implications of that for how we live our married lives. But let me turn the question and connect it to your second one. I just came back from a week in Lithuania helping the Catholic Church in that country mark the 20th anniversary of the visit of John Paul II in 1993, after Lithuania had recovered its independence. I gave a lecture at Vilnius University in the political science faculty. The subject was what contemporary theories, political and economic theories, can and cannot be fit into the social doctrine of the Catholic Church. Had a nice time, very intelligent young people, excellent English language skills, which is the only way this could have happened, given the extreme poverty of my Lithuanian. But with 15 minutes to go, I said to them, look, this has been marvelously interesting. These are great questions. These are the questions I'm delighted to see that you're wrestling with at this stage of your academic formation. But permit me to make a point. None of this discussion of the future of politics, economics, or culture is going to make the slightest bit of difference until Lithuania starts having children again. Birth rate is 1.3, similar throughout other parts of Eastern Europe. This is the greatest self-induced collapse of population in the history of the world. Indeed, it's the only self-induced one. There have been population disasters before, but they've been caused by war or plague or natural disaster. Europe is in demographic freefall. That has a lot to do with the sundering of sexual love from procreation made possible by cheap, effective, privately available, privately utilizable means of contraception. It now appears to me very clear that the third great scientific development of the 20th century, after the splitting of the atom and the unraveling of the DNA double helix, both of which are world historical changes in our understanding, was the invention of the oral contraceptive pill, which has clearly had a dramatic impact throughout the world to the point where Europe is now systematically depopulating itself. There are no simple answers to this. There may not even be any hearable answers to this. But it's something we need to think about. When Pope Paul VI, 35 years ago, wrote that highly controversial encyclical, the birth control encyclical, and warned about a contraceptive mentality, he seems to have been onto something. And as a culture and a nation, we need to reflect on this. I mean, America is actually doing better than the rest of the developed world in terms of birth rates, but this is the fundamental social issue in Europe today. There aren't enough people, and there aren't going to be enough people 50, 100 years out. I mentioned this in a discussion with 6 policy intellectuals in Vilnius, and one of them actually claims to have determined when the last Estonian will leave the scene. 2067 was his calculation. It's a very small country of just over 1 million people, and even lower birth rate than Lithuania. This is human drama at a very fundamental level. And our culture seems unable to really think about it. And it's something, to get to your last point, that should be of great concern to people who have different moral views about the appropriate means of regulating fertility, and to both non-believers and believers alike. Yes?
Yes. So because the Catholic Church emphasizes tradition so heavily, frequently when there's a period of reform, it's seen as a surrender to whatever the current culture is. And we saw that with Vatican II, where we had fundamentalists who completely rejected the council because they saw it as surrendering to modernism. And then we had modernists who took it to the extreme and wildly overreacted and thought that pretty much anything went after Vatican II. And I think we're starting to see some of that happening now with the reforms that Francis is enacting, especially in the way that the media has portrayed it. So I was wondering what steps you thought we could take as a church to sort of minimize that notion that we're somehow surrendering to modern culture and changing the church fundamentally.
Well, it seems to me that in general we are moving into a calmer period. The agitations of the 70s and 80s are largely resolved. Here's one indicator of rebound. The American College in Rome, the North American College, has more students today than at any period since 1963. That is true of other seminaries around the country. That's just one indicator. Something like 250,000 people freely as adults seek baptism in the Catholic Church or full communion with the Catholic Church from other Christian communities at the Easter Vigil every year. Something is moving. Then I can point to where my family and I spend the summer in Quebec, which used to be a vibrantly Catholic culture and is now the most religiously arid place between Point Barrow and Tierra del Fuego, without exception. I mean, it's gone. So, that's the portrait. I mean, vitality and death. And as we move into what is going to be, I think, a very exciting ride with this new Pope, a little faith in his commitment to the truth of Catholic faith, and a little confidence that the Holy Spirit has not abandoned the Church, might help everybody calm down just a bit. And of course, it always helps in dealing with these, shall we say, selective excerpts of long interviews to read the whole text itself. I'm afraid we're over time. Thank you all very much for being here. It's great to be with you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.